Welcome to Faith in Practice. My name is James Beavers, and this is part one of our series on biblical theology. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, it doesn't mean theology that is biblical. Hopefully that would be all of our theology. Biblical theology refers to the organizing principle. So basically what that means is you have systematic theology, and systematic theology tries to create a system of doctrine and asks the question, what does the entire Bible say about topic X? Historical theology takes the development of a doctrine as it develops throughout church history. Practical theology takes the entirety of the Bible's teaching on a certain issue and sees how that pertains to a practical issue, like what kind of music do we play in church, what are the qualifications for a pastor, what does it mean for a pastor to be a pastor. And so biblical theology is the organizing principle in the sense that we're examining how a certain doctrine or a theme develops throughout the Bible, so from Genesis to Revelation. So that's what we mean when we say it's the organizing principle. So what we don't mean by biblical theology is how Johann Gabler defined it in 1787. He basically saw biblical theology as sort of a dispassionate historical inquiry. So like, what did the Israelites believe in 800 BC? And that was the dominant view for a long time. We're going to go with the way that Gerhardus Voss defined it about 100 years later. He tried to bring the concept and the field of biblical theology back into the realm of Orthodox confessional Christianity. Since I don't want to read out the definition, I'll just let you guys read it. So let's unpack that. So exhibition basically just means the showing. Organic means that each subsequent piece of revelation is organically related to what came before and grounds whatever comes afterward. So Voss used the example of a seed that develops into a small plant, which develops into a sapling and into a tree. It's all the same thing, but it's all related to the subsequent stages of the development. The process means that it's going somewhere. It's not static. It's not a circle. It's the process of supernatural revelation, because that's what we're dealing with here. We're trying to do theology, which means that we want to get to know God. It means that we're using His revelation as our starting point for our entire discussion, our entire inquiry, in its historic continuity, which is basically the organizing principle of biblical theology, how we trace the development of something as we go through the Bible's history, but also historic continuity and multiformity, because the Bible isn't just saying the same thing over and over again. There's diversity within the biblical material. So what we want to be doing in this series is basically two things. We want to be tracing the development of the theme of redemption, the theme of salvation as it goes throughout the Bible, and that'll basically be the same thing that we mean when we talk about redemptive history. And then we want to maybe, towards the end of the series, transition into doing videos on individual themes in biblical theology, be that temple, Eden, living with God, kingship, priesthood, and then short videos to show how that theme develops in the Bible. So the question that we need to answer is this even legitimate? Can we just take a bunch of different texts written by different authors and trace themes throughout them? Or is there even like a commonality there? And we want to say yes, and there's fundamentally three different reasons that we see as unifying principles in the development of Scripture. So the first of those is that Scripture has a divine author. We see that in passages like 2 Peter 1:19 and the following verses, 2 Timothy 3:16, that all of Scripture is inspired by God. So you have the human authors, like Moses and Paul, and they didn't have anything to do with each other other than the fact that maybe Paul read Moses. But there's also one author that gives the narrative structure to the entire Bible and is the ultimate author behind the human authors. The second unifying principle, which forms the basis of our pursuit of biblical theology, is the Christological content of Scripture, that it all points to Christ. And I'm actually going to read out 1 Peter 1:10 through 12, because I think this is a really key passage. 1 Peter 1:10 to 12 says, "As to this salvation," so that's the gospel, "the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you," that's obviously salvation, "made careful searches and inquiries, seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating when He predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow." So there's the prophets, and they are finding out, and they know about that Christ is going to come, and not only that Christ is going to come, but that Christ is going to suffer, and that glory will ensue, so that will be redemption. "It was revealed to them," verse 12, "that they were not serving themselves." So the prophets were not working for themselves, but they were serving you in these things which have now been announced to you through those who preach the gospel. So The Christological content of Scripture basically means that all of Scripture points to Christ, and that even the Old Testament prophets knew that. That doesn't mean that the bears in 2 Kings 2 were pre-incarnate Christ, but it does mean that the entire structure of the narrative does point to Christ. And we see that in passages like 1 Corinthians 10, in Paul's discussion of the Exodus. We see that in passages like Luke 24, where Jesus is talking to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he says, "You are slow of heart to believe all that Moses and the prophets said concerning me." And then he unpacks where throughout all of Scripture, it's pointing to Christ. That's what Luke is doing in Acts 26, where he says that Moses prophesied the sufferings of Christ. So that's the second one, the Christological content of Scripture. And the third one is the purpose of Scripture. So all of Scripture is about God's redemption of fallen mankind. So from Genesis to Revelation, where everything starts in a good creation and everything ends in a new creation, the Bible is about God bringing fallen man back into a relationship with him. So there's a unified subject of Scripture. So those are three fundamental unifying principles that form the basis upon which we can do biblical theology. So on that basis, we want to spend this series exploring how individual themes and structures in the Bible hang together. We want to go through the whole narrative of the Bible and show how it ends with Christ and points to Christ. Mostly we want to give people confidence to read the Bible on their own, to understand the content of Scripture, especially the Old Testament, and see how those passages fit into a whole, really to have confidence in their own ability to read God's Word.